Ralsei. I love Ralsei. Ralsei's the best, and we have not a single earthly clue what Ralsei is supposed to be. Inklings, perhaps, but no definitive explanations. It seems like the only all-encompassing theories we can generate have to resort to the abstract and the unsubstantiated, because no concept introduced thus far is a perfect one-to-one match and without contradictions. I think we can at least safely say at this point that Ralsei is probably not an object, at least not in the conventional sense. Upon entering the Castletown fountain at the end of Chapter 5, Ralsei appears to greet Susie, which is fairly definitive evidence against the theory that Ralsei is an object Kris always has on them, the horned headband, or the green crayon, or anything of the sort. The only way he can be an object is if he is an object situated within the closet, and him appearing in other Dark Worlds implies that if that is the answer, it's not the answer in its entirety, because no other objects can exist in spaces they're not physically in. The abstract explanations proposed include him being roots that lay beneath the town, a being of pure darkness, a vessel, and while there's evidence for all of those, there are characteristics about Ralsei which seem to demand explanations those don't provide. For example, none provide a justification for Ralsei's dreamer-like appearance. Ralsei is very deliberately meant to look like a boss monster, being of the same floppy-eared species as Toriel and Asgore, bearing a particular resemblance to Asriel. The Ralsei-Asriel dichotomy is interesting in that they share similarities such that an untrained eye would think them identical, but someone who has spent a lot of time with one or the other would be able to clock the differences immediately. What this means is that Ralsei, his nature, and his origin story are likely related to Asriel, but they probably don't begin nor end with, nor wholly consist of Asriel. It should be stated outright that any direct or implicit links to Asriel must run up against the very real fact that Toby is coding Ralsei's infatuation with Kris as romantic. See the unique blush sprite when Ralsei is describing Kris being in his ideal future. I think this, in and of itself, should wall off certain categories of theories, at least practically speaking. The theory you're about to hear was originally generated by my good friend Clay, who, were he an established YouTuber, may be one of the leading DELTARUNE theorists right now. He's that knowledgeable and innovative. But given he's busy being a nuclear engineer and policy advisor and stuff, I figured I'd be his platform, and use my encyclopedic knowledge of DELTARUNE to make more robust his thoughts. With that out of the way, onwards and upwards. This theory started when Clay was reflecting on the constant references that DELTARUNE has made to Kris summoning a demon. This has been brought up fairly consistently since the beginning and keeps getting added onto with subsequent chapters, the newest chapter revealing that Caddy backed out of the ritual at the last second and left Kris to perform the ritual on their lonesome. Two main theories have emerged to explain what the outcome of this ritual was. The first is that Kris summoned Friend, the demon cat frequently associated with satanic imagery, and who now appears to be stalking them through the Dark World. This is additionally bolstered by Caddy, a fairly incidental character as of this point, being involved with the ritual. Caddy is very aesthetically similar to Friend, being of course a cat, but also a cat who has pink and gold in her color scheme. However, the newly patched in Mew Mew scene seems to imply that Friend is not one entity, but in fact multiple cats, a herd, who answer to a master. It's an odd visual, Kris summoning just one out of a bunch of subordinates to some greater threat. The other theory is that this ritual led Kris to summoning the Soul, that we're the demon who came when Kris called our name. There is justification for that, it seeming to be the case that we were summoned deliberately as a component of whatever plan Kris and Carol are engaging in, and it potentially being the case that Kris gave up their original soul in exchange. Otherwise, there's not much of an explanation for where it went if you assume Kris had an original soul. And while we don't have much demonic imagery, Gaster, who seems to have had a hand in the soul summoning, most certainly does. In spades. There are timeline problems with this. The soul may have only been summoned at the onset of DELTARUNE's plot when Caddy seems to imply the demonic ritual happened way in the past, to the extent her and Kris have grown distant since it happened. Additionally, if Kris did summon the soul as a component of a secret conspiracy, it seems odd that they would involve Caddy in it to begin with. Clay's theory, not to be confused with Clay theory, is that the demon that was summoned was Ralsei. Ralsei has an obvious connection to Kris, in the form of the pinkish horns on top of his head. Demon imagery again, for one thing, but also a visual callback to the red horned headband that Kris wore in their youth when they were insecure about being the only monster in hometown and aspiring to be a goat-like boss monster like their family. It's easy to imagine that Kris, growing up, would have preferred to look more like Ralsei. When imagining their ideal self, it's possible that Ralsei was what they imagined. It's also described that Kris very much looked up to their big brother, So perhaps, specifically, they modeled their image of their ideal self after him. And the truth is, Ralsei isn't just aesthetically Kris's ideal self, he seems to represent a lot of what Kris wishes they were. Ralsei acts with extreme kindness and tolerance towards everybody. He's sweet and outgoing, a friend's friend. Kris has frequently struggled with loneliness throughout their upbringing, drifting away from childhood friends such as Noelle and Caddy and becoming completely isolated after Asriel left for college. Perhaps Kris believes, in their wallow in self-pity, that were they just different, were they the kind of extrovert who could carry themselves with kindness and grace, maybe they would have the friends they so desire. Pathologize Kris however you'd like. The truth is, whatever they feel is wrong with themselves, it's easy to imagine that they would see Ralsei as someone easier to be friends with. Someone who would have been able to keep the friendships Kris lost, reach out to people Kris never could, and refrain from making whatever mistakes Kris once made. Ralsei is also renowned for his omnipotence, for knowing all the answers, a cover-to-cover knowledge of the prophecy, these worlds and all that they consist of. To Kris, that could represent a privilege frequently denied to them. The true nature of Des's disappearance, known at this point only to Toby Fox, could have easily consumed Kris. After all, a plausible motivation for them engaging in the conspiracy is to find her, to wash clean whatever mistakes they made back then, to make up for what they weren't able to prevent. Kris could have spent so long fiending for a resolution, fiending for answers, fiending over a mastery of the darkness they were powerless to save Des from, that they would desperately want the kind of knowledge that Ralsei possesses. Think even about Ralsei's infatuation with Kris. While there's no wholly comfortable way to interpret it, it's easy to read Kris as being self-hating, potentially self-harming. It's easy to imagine that there's noise in Kris's head that paralyzes them, oppresses them. It's easy to look at Kris and see an insecure teenager who just can't find a way to love themselves, no matter how hard they try. There's something powerful in the idea that Kris's ideal self looks at them and sees someone worth loving, worth building a future with. The theory posited by Clay is that after Des's disappearance, whether Kris was involved with it, powerless to stop it, or otherwise distraught beyond words, they were struck with a sense of responsibility. They wanted to bring her back, felt that whatever they had to do to make that happen would be worth it. Whatever they needed to become to make that happen would be worth it. The physical world, reality, would provide few answers, so Kris would turn to what they felt was their only recourse, the metaphysical, the supernatural, the occult. They turned to Caddy, and attempted to perform a ritual. Rituals are means to an end. Kris's end? Their friend back. And if they felt that their friend was lost because they weren't good enough, perhaps their wish was for the angel, the devil, whoever was listening, to send someone who was everything they weren't, everything they wished they were, somebody who wasn't a human, someone who was strong enough, smart enough, kind enough, determined enough to brave the darkness and rescue their friend. And it was from that ritual that Ralsei was born. This also adds up with additional details surrounding the Dark Fountains. We are told in Asgore's notes about a, quote, first fountain that opened at some point in the past, this presumably being the fountain that Des got lost in. To me, the greatest contender for this first fountain would be the shelter, given the shelter's additional connections to Des's disappearance. Ralsei's knowledge about Dark Worlds does not appear to extend to this first fountain, as he is surprised by its existence, properties, and overall nature. Ralsei additionally seems unaware of the shelter fountain in general, given how, in his opening speech to Kris and Susie, he describes how the impetus for his urgency was the Card Castle fountain opening, as it threatened the balance between light and dark. This is not the state you would expect to find him in if this was the third fountain and not the second. As a result, Clay theorized that Ralsei is unaware of the shelter fountain's existence because it was created before he was. As a result, he was potentially birthed from the Castletown's Dark Fountain, which came later, which explains why he is intrinsically linked to that location. What this creates for us is the possibility that the ritual Kris performed that created Ralsei, why, it was opening the Castletown Dark Fountain. Dark Fountains are described as being born from will, from determination. You course your will into the earth through your blade. Kris, who was likely attending that very school with Caddy, may have picked the Dark Supply Closet as the location for the ritual. Kris imbued all of their wants, their ideals, dare I say their hopes and dreams, into the blade. They summoned the Castletown Dark Fountain, and the result of all their pining, their dreaming, their wanting? Ralsei. Everything they ever wanted to be. Think too about the fact that the first time we enter the Castletown Dark Fountain, there's already save data for Kris there. They've been here before. Perhaps they even saw Ralsei. And perhaps, realizing what they had done, they ran out screaming, telling everyone, They summoned a demon. Think about the fact that Kris seems quite uncomfortable around Ralsei for the early parts of their adventures together, evidenced by their willingness and almost perverse glee in doing things like throwing the manual on the ground, and by the Ralsei tea healing mechanic. Kris is uncomfortable around Ralsei because he was a mistake they made as a kid, that they made in one of their darkest moments, for one of the darkest reasons. Ralsei was a manifestation of Kris's self-hatred. And this ties into the thematic purpose of Ralsei being Kris's ideal self, because Kris, at least at first, rejects their ideal self. They thought this is what they wanted, but it's not. Ralsei is putting on a mask. He's trying so hard to be what he's supposed to be perhaps what he thinks Kris wants him to be. But when you look deeper into Ralsei, he and Kris share many of the same problems. Ralsei is just as lonely as Kris, both described as being completely isolated. Both are insecure about their appearances, about even their species, to the extent of projecting that hatred onto their view of the species as a whole. Both display extreme insecurity, self-hatred. Both struggle with identity and place. Both struggle with expectations and belonging. Both struggle with having deep, profound emotions, negative ones and positive ones, that they feel the need to suppress. In fact, the very traits that make Ralsei Kris's ideal self, his pure and kind heart, his knowing all the answers, his species, are the very things that cause Ralsei the most pain. Ralsei isn't what Kris wanted to be. Ralsei is what Kris thought they wanted to be. But the truth is, becoming Ralsei wouldn't have solved any of Kris's problems. It wouldn't suddenly make friends flock to them. It wouldn't suddenly make those intrusive thoughts, that noise, fade away. It wouldn't make them feel like they belonged. And Ralsei, at the end of the day, still doesn't know about the original fountain. He still doesn't know about Des. He's still powerless, and still crushed by that. Ralsei represents the superficial idea of self-improvement. He represents a view of self-improvement grounded in escapism, one frequently espoused by people who struggle with self-hatred. If only I was someone else. The truth is, even if you were someone else, that wouldn't inherently mean it would stop. Kris's problems wouldn't be solved if they were a goat, if they were bubbly and good at hugs. What Kris needed was not to become different, but to become the best version of themselves. One cannot strive to be different until they truly accept themselves as they are. Accept that what lies at their core is something worth fighting for, something that can change. What Kris needed was not to be Ralsei. What Kris needed was to be Kris. You'll notice that arc. It's exactly the same arc that Ralsei is going on. You'll notice that it's only when Ralsei makes meaningful progress in that arc that Kris begins to grow more comfortable around him. Ralsei, sobbing in front of Kris, tries to put on a brave face, tries to keep smiling, as if to say, "Isn't this what you wanted, Kris? Isn't this what you created me to be?" And when you say, "No, it's okay not to smile. You're enough," Kris gets down and embraces Ralsei. And perhaps, in Kris's mind, they may also be embracing themselves.